Steve King, Representative Steve King from Iowa. I'm sure you all heard the news. He went to the New York Times, gave an interview, and he said something that was both innocuous in some way. I think it's innocuous coming from his generation, and I'll talk about that. But it was political poison, a political bombshell in other ways. I'll just read the quote. Exactly. White nationalist, white supremacist Western civilization. How did that language become offensive? Well, that was a not a very politic thing to say in the current year. First off, I think Steve King should be given his due, and I think we should try to understand King on his own terms. Steve King is a boomer's boomer. He is 69 years old. And I think he was actually speaking quite truthfully when he said, when did this become a bad thing? Now, I don't know how many people in Iowa were talking about the glories of white supremacy when he was 10 years old or something like that. But the fact is, he grew up in a Cold War environment in which the educational system was shot through with what you could call Americanism and anti-Soviet, pro-America, pro-capitalism, pro-freedom propaganda. And part of that was a kind of jingoism, you could say, in which it was asserted and everyone firmly believed that America was the greatest damn thing ever to appear in the face of this old earth of ours. You could not question that. It was not just a good country. It wasn't just our country. It was the last great hope for all mankind. So it was a universalist idea, that form of nationalism. It was not the type of nationalism you'd see in other places. And I think someone like Steve King imbibed this and truly believed it. And what's interesting about this is that kind of Americanism, as we can call it, is an older version of the left. And so Steve King, like so many conservatives, isn't so much a reactionary or a traditionalist or alt-right or what have you. He's more behind. He's saying something that would have been accepted 40 years ago, but is now verboten because we've moved on. And so what we had this past 24 hours is really a battle between concepts of Americanism. You have this mid-century Cold War propaganda that Steve King believes in. And I think he's also being very genuine when he says, this isn't about race. It's just about, assimilating to our values and so on. I think he actually does genuinely believe it. That was part of it, because these, people of his generation, they just simply assume that this is going to be a white country. You don't have to inquire about what it means to live in a white country, or what is the real composition of this nation. You simply can just assume it and then say that, oh, this immigrant, this guy down the street who immigrated here from India or China or whatever, he'll just congeal to our values as a minority. Well, we live in a different world, and the concept of Americanism that predominates, certainly on the mainstream media, certainly on the left, and to a very large extent on the so-called right, is a different form of Americanism. It is the notion of a post-white, multiracial democracy. And to say something like Western values, even that is a kind of euphemism, but even that is too much. But I would remind everyone that these Western values that Steve King is promoting are effectively neoconservatism. They are, democracy for all, liberalism, military going around the world, and all that kind of stuff. I would not classify him as a European identitarian or a traditionalist, really, of any kind. In fact, he's a Christian Zionist, which has its own problems, which I won't go into. I also wanted to talk about another aspect of this, which is very important in terms of ideology, and I think this will actually lead into the discussion. Bill Regnery told me this aphorism of Sam Francis, and I don't know if Sam Francis ever wrote this down in one of his many articles, but he certainly delivered this in conversation. And that is that both the left elite and the right elite are to the left of their constituents. So both the left elite and the right elite are to the left of their constituents. And so if you look at the left elite, the people that at least the white people who they get to vote, say Democratic, are fairly normal for all intents and purposes. You don't have a Cal Berkeley gender seminar, in Iowa voting Democratic. You have some very normal people who might even have legitimate concerns, which is why they vote for the Democrats. The elite, however, are far to the left of those voters, and in fact, they get energized by the far left. They certainly do not denounce the far left. Far from it, they get energized by it. Now, they might not want to go too fast. They might want to slow down those people who are on the far left who are too excited, but they are energized by them. And so, leftists will put forward things like gay marriage that they couldn't have even imagined of, 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier, certainly. And then they're just kind of waiting for the next thing. What's next? Transgendered bathrooms, bestiality marriage. Who knows? No one can imagine. But actually, there are people who can imagine it. And that is the far left intellectuals and dogmatists who are pushing this stuff and who ultimately inform the thinking of the mainstream left, like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. The right is completely different. The right elites are to the left of the constituents. I would say that most people who vote for Republican probably are kind of nationalist, populist. You could even say racist if you want to. They have a, they're not me. They're not, they're not thinking or culture thug. They're not thinking through this stuff every night. But they're racialist or nationalist of the heart and of the stomach, you could say. Maybe not the head. And they are always being controlled and informed by an elite like National Review, like Fox News, etc., who are to their left, often far to their left. And as opposed to being energized by the far right, they spend all of their time denouncing the far right. This is not a new phenomenon. We have seen this for years, but with Buckley, it was explicit, it was flamboyant. But the fact is that is the American right, and I don't see this really changing. It did change a little bit with Trump, but Steve King, I reacted very harshly to Steve King's public statement, basically saying, "Oh, I'm a nationalist. I believe in Western values. It's not about race." And I condemn white nationalism, which came into full expression in the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were died. So he didn't just say that white identity and consciousness and ultimately white identity politics, he didn't just say that that's wrong or misguided, or I wish they'd rethink their views. He said that those views are wicked and that they inherently lead to mass murder of a scale that none of us can imagine. So he attacked us morally. He attacked and he demoralized the identitarian right in a radical way. And so this idea that, Steve King's our guy, or he's so good, he'll support the wall or whatever, to be honest, this is all this stuff is just falling on deaf ears. These people might be good on some issues here and there. They're very often bad on some very important issues, particularly foreign policy, but they might be good here and there. Build the wall, sure. But on the real fundamental moral issues, they are totally off the rails, totally wrong. So it isn't just a matter of nudging Steve King here and there. This is a 69-year-old man. He is not going to fundamentally change his moral views. He's probably not going to change his policy views. And he absolutely condemned identitarianism on moral terms and not on policy terms or intellectual terms. This kind of thing has to end. These people like Steve King are the blocks that are standing in the way of a real identitarian right. So long as we see these people, like the Gavin McInnes types, who does the same thing as Steve King, although he has tattoos and plays punk music or whatever, or the Steve Kings, so long as they are there, so long as they are the representatives of white America. We're going to be in this constant logic where the left gets to play identity politics and the right basically morally condemns identity politics and morally condemns identity politics really of the right, of white people, in far, far more vehement terms than they would ever criticize a leftist or a Democrat. That dynamic has to end. It just has to. And so I must be frank. I don't see any future for Steve King, and I don't want there to be a great future for Steve King. These people just simply that kind of civic nationalism really has to go. I think this is a very interesting situation where we are, because what the left is telling us, and even what the right is telling us, is that Western chauvinism, civic nationalism is impossible now. It is unacceptable. And I think in a way that is a good thing, because it makes the real identitarian right the ultimate only option. Whew. All right, there you go. There's my rant.